Okay, so obviously the first thing that we need to do is look at how the database is going to be set up. Now this is going to be pretty easy, to be honest. We're only going to have a couple of tables, and the first table is going to be where the users are stored. So the users of your application, depending on how you're signing them in. So let's create this table now. So I'm just going to call this users. I'm using SQL Pro to manage my database, but you can use PHP MyAdmin or on the command line, whatever you prefer. So we've got an ID here, which is a type of int. It's a primary key, and it has an auto increment on it as well. So it will increment for each record added, and it's obviously an unsigned integer. We're also going to have a username in here, and that's it. We're just going to have this as a varchar and set this to maybe 20 characters, depending on how your application works. And I'm going to just insert one record here, and that's going to be record 1 Alex. That's it. So now that we've done that, we can create our items table. So this is going to contain all of the to-do list items. So we've obviously got an ID with the same properties as the one in the users table. It works the same. We're going to have name, which is basically the name of the item. This is going to be text because we're going to allow for quite large items. We're going to have a user, which is going to be an integer. This is just basically going to point to the user that's currently that's added this item, so we can identify which items to pull in depending on which user's logged in. We have a done field and we have a created field. So user is going to be an int, done is going to be a boolean, which will effectively result in a tiny int, which is with a length of 1, and created will be a date time. Now we'll be storing this value, but we won't actually be outputting this value. However, you can do what you want. Once you've grasped how this works, you can give sort of due dates or, whatever you want. So what we're going to do initially is we're going to add some items in here, and then we're going to actually just output them into our design, our list of items just here. So let's do this now. At the moment, we've got 2 test items. So let's just get rid of one of them. So we've got one here, and we'll place this in a loop. So over in our database, let's create the first one. And this will be, go vegan. Let's hit OK. The user is going to be 1. Done is going to be 0. And created, in here I can just type the now function, and that just gives me the date and time. The next one, let's say turn off lights to save energy and money. And let's hit OK. And for the user, let's say 1 as well. And done, let's just say 1. And again, created, let's just put now. So we've got 2 items and we've got 1 user. So these 2 items belong to this user. So what we can now do is, inside of our app, let's go ahead and connect to our database. That's probably the first thing we should really do, because otherwise we can't access these records. So I'm going to create a folder called app, and in here I'm going to create a file called init.php. This is just going to be everything that I need to initialize my application, start sessions, connect to my database, and this can be shared across all files. So the first thing is to say session start. This just allows us to store items or keys or values inside of the session superglobal. So I'm going to say user ID, and that's going to be 1. So that's just faking a login basically for user with a user ID of 1. So here I'm going to create a new PDO instance. So I'm instantiating PDO. This is going to be connecting to our database. So this is PHP data objects. Because we're going to be doing things like prepared statements, we need this functionality available. So we're connecting using MySQL driver. The DB name is to do. And our host here is localhost or 127.0.0.1. And then after this, as a second value, we provide the username, and then we provide the password. In my case, both are just root. So down here, you will want to handle this in some other way, but I'm just going to create a quick if statement here to say if not is set $_session user ID. That just basically means, is this user logged in? So is this or is this value set? I'm just going to say die, you are not signed in. This is in no way a foolproof solution. It's just demonstrating that if this isn't available, we can't store a value inside of here with user because it doesn't exist. So we have to be signed in to use this. Anyway, we can include this on index.php up here, so we can make use of the fact that sessions have started. We can make use of database functionality as well. So let's do a require once on app init.php, and down here let's create an items query to basically give us our items. So the items query is a prepared statement, so we use the prepare method on our DB object, and in here I'm just going to pull this down to multiple lines. We're going to select the ID, the name, and done, so that's 0 or 1 depending on the items, whether the item's done or not, from the items table where the user equals user. Now this is a placeholder, and what this means is that what we do is, to prevent SQL injection, we execute this passing in the placeholders. That will prepare, or we've prepared the statement here, then we execute the statement, and this just basically means that we don't have to escape each of these manually. So I'm just going to say items query execute. Now that will run the query, but we need to pass in an array with this user value. So we can say user $_session user ID, which is the session we set in here. So what this will now do is give us a list of items where the user equals the current logged in user. So we're grabbing ID, name, and done. Okay, so now what we can do is we can say items equals, and we're going to do a ternary operator here. This will basically check whether there's a sufficient row count on items. Otherwise, we'll just set this to an empty array. So essentially what we're going to do is say items query row count. If this is a positive number, then we want to say items query. Otherwise, we want to say empty array. So now what we can actually do down here to test things out is do a print R on items. And we can even do an echo and stick some pre-tags around this, which will give us a better representation of how this looks, like so. So let's refresh, and there we go. Oops, sorry. Oh, this should be fine if we do a for each loop on this, which is what we're going to be doing later. So for example, I do a for each on items as item. Here what I can do is echo item name, and then I can do a little break here just as an example. That will give me, oh sorry, this will be an array. There we go. So that will give us an array within these. So for each item, this item is going to be an array. We can do a print R on item to see this, like so. So that will give us an array here with an ID of 1, and then we've got name, go vegan, blah, 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 blah. So obviously, if there are no items, we're not going to create this unordered list markup. So I'm going to create an if statement here to say if not empty items, then we can go ahead and do this unordered list. So we can end the if here. But you might want to do a little bit of an else down here. So you might want to say else, and then in here we can just create a paragraph and say something like you haven't added any items yet. So that's going to look like the following, because remember this is static. We're not actually outputting the items from the database yet. But if we were to say change the user of both of these records to 2, I'm logged in as user 1, so it now says you haven't added any items yet. So let me go ahead and just change these back to 1, like so. And back in here, we're actually going to loop through now. So above the list item, we want to do a for each loop, much like I did just a moment ago up there. I'm going to say for each items as item, and down here we want to end that for each, so end for each, like so. And we'll go ahead and indent this. So this now we need to replace with the actual item name. So in here we can do a PHP echo item name. And let's take a look at that. There we go. So we've got go vegan and turn off lights to save energy and money. And then we need to work out whether this is done. And we need to work that out for the reason of adding a class in here, and also whether we need to display this or not. So just in here, let's do an echo, and we're going to say echo, and we're going to do a ternary operator here as well. So we're going to say item done. So if the item is done, we want to output a space and then done. So after item, there'll then be a space and then the additional class of done, otherwise just an empty string. So remember, we've got that one done, but we don't want to show this now that it's done. So all we need to do is down here, do another if statement. So we can say if item, done. Then down here, end that if. And in actual fact, we need to negate this. So if not item done, then it stays. So here we've got markers done, and here we haven't because this has been marked as done. So now what you can do is play around with this. So we could set this to 1 as well, and you would see that they both get checked off. So obviously at the moment we have to manually do this, but we will add a link in when we do the marking functionality. So now that we've done this, basically we can start to actually add items. So I can type in here pick up shopping. I can hit add. That's going to go through to add.php, which we don't currently have available, so we're going to build that now. So let's create a new file, and let's save this as add.php. And in here, this is obviously a PHP file. Now we need to bring in our initialization file because this contains our database connection and our session as well. So we're going to require once app init.php, much like we did just a moment ago. And inside of here, we need to basically check if the name, i.e. this, the name of the item we're adding, has been successfully submitted through to this. So is it available in the post superglobal array, which we'll look at in a moment. Then we'll store it, and then we'll prepare a statement to insert it. We'll execute that, and then we'll redirect the user back to index.php. And this will then give us the ability to add as many items as we want. So you'll actually see this come to life now. So we do a quick if statement here to check if that's available. So we say if is set $_post name. If it is available, I want to store that in a variable here. So it's $_post name. And what we can also do as well is do a trim on this. So we wrap this in our trim function. This will get rid of white space on the left and the right hand side. So just in case someone does something like a space, we'll get rid of all of that. Okay, so now we want to check if this value is not empty. Now we're not redirecting back with an error message. We're just doing this so we don't add an empty item to the database. But you can, of course, add in some kind of message if you want. So we're going to say if not empty name, that just means has something or is something contained within that variable. Then we're going to create an added query. And this is going to be db prepare, so much like we did to actually grab our records. But this time we're inserting. It works exactly the same thing with a prepared, exactly the same way with a prepared statement. We do insert into items. We choose the field that we want to insert on. That's name, user, done, and created. We don't need to insert an ID. That's automatically incremented for us. Now we insert the values. So name, user. For done, we're just going to say 0. We don't even have to include this, to be honest. We could just get rid of that altogether. But let's just do it for the sake of it being a little bit clearer. And then we have our now function here, which will populate the date and time in our created at date time field. So now that we've done that, we need to execute this query, passing in the placeholder values, which is name and user. We know that the name exists here. We know that the user exists here. So we have this available to us. So let's say added query, execute, and in here we'll pass in an array these values. So name is just name, and user is just $_session user ID. And outside of this if statement, regardless of what's been done, we're going to use a header to locate back to index.php. So there's probably better ways of redirecting your users in terms of maybe flashing a message or something, but because this is very basic, all we're doing is whatever happens here, regardless of any errors within this query, we're redirecting back. So now what we can actually do is, as long as everything's working okay, we could say something like pick up shopping. That value is now going to be submitted through to that and inserted into the database with our user ID, and there we go, it's added in. So we've now got pick up shopping added. That's it, it's been added to our list. So let's say do something else and add that one, and there we go, they're just being added to our list. To finish things off, we need to do our marking as done functionality. So we need to mark these as done. We've already got the functionality to display that it's done, so all we really need to do now is have some way of clicking mark as done and actually marking this. And all that involves, remember, is changing this done. If we just refresh here, this done here from 0 to 1. So let's create a new file, and this file is going to be called mark.php. Now bear in mind, we need to take some precaution here, some security precaution, because technically what I could do is, if I know if I could guess the ID of a user's to-do, I could mark their to-do as done, even though it doesn't belong to me. So we need to take that into account. So let's require in app init.php, and before we go any further on this file, let's take a look at inside of here what the actual link is going to look like. So when a user clicks mark as done, they obviously want to go through to mark.php, but we need to send some variables along with this, and we're going to do this in the query string. So what we're going to do is I'm going to say as equals done. What this basically means is we now have a variable, if you like, called as, and its value is now set to done. What we also want to say is item equals and then the ID of the item. Obviously this is dynamic, it depends on which item that we're currently looking at, so we're going to create a opening and closing PHP tag here and echo out item ID. So now basically what this looks like is, if we just refresh, let's just inspect the page and head over to this. So we can now see this has an as of done, and I'll explain why we've done that in a moment. An item is 3. So this item here has the ID of 3. But if we go down to the next one, this has an ID of 4. So now that we have the IDs in there, let's quickly go and pick these up. But as basically means the action that you want to do. I'm not going to do this in this video, but say you want to mark this as not done. Again, so you want to change that back from 1 to 0. You can implement this in the switch that we're going to be creating in mark.php. So I've just left it flexible for you to modify if you need to. So inside of mark.php, we need to check for 2 things this time, and they're not in the post superglobal like we did when we added, because we're not submitting a form with the method of post. We're actually including these in the query string. So we're going to use isSet this time to check $_get as and $_get item. So as is the action associated with this. Let's just store that in a variable there. Oops. Like get as, and here it's item, and that's $_get item. Let's just pull these in a bit so they're aligned. So now we're going to do a switch, and the reason I'm doing a switch is this makes it a little bit easier if you want to add different actions, so undone or not done or delete or whatever you want to do. You can do this in here. So we're going to switch on as. If as equals done, we want to do something in here, like so. So what do we want to do if we're marking it as done? Well, we're updating the value. So we're going to say done query, and this is going to be a prepared statement. And inside of here, what do we want to do? We want to update items, set done equals to 1, where the ID of the item equals the item. We're going to have a placeholder for that. Now, you could just leave it as this, but like I mentioned, you need to make sure it's the same user marking their own item. So we also want to say and where the user equals a particular user. Then we can pass in the user session to validate that it is actually them marking their own item as done. That's really, really important. So now down here, we can say done query, execute, and in here, execute, and in here we can pass in that value, so or both these values. So item is just going to be item here, and we're also going to pass in the user, which is again straight from that session at the key user ID. And then again, we're just going to be a little bit lazy, and we're just going to redirect the user back to index.php, whatever happens here. So now let's just recap, because this might be a little bit confusing. Let's just close these off. So when a user hits mark, this is dynamically adding in the ID. So we can identify which item that we want to mark as a particular action. In this case, we're marking as done. So when we go over to mark.php, we detect that this is as done. So then we can mark it as done. If it was, say, undone or not done, you would add a case here for not done and break that there. And in here, all you would do is literally the same thing, but you would set done to 0. So you could actually implement this yourself if you wanted to, but we're not going to be doing it. So you could have a not done button. Anyway, that's then going to run that, and it's going to redirect us back to index.php. So as long as everything's working fine, we can hit mark as done, and that marks each of them items as done. And that is how we create a very basic to-do list. Go ahead and try and add a little bit more functionality to this and see what you can do.